Hello, and thank you again for joining us. We at Mars International are proud to present the next video in our series, Long-Term Work-From-Home Strategies, Lessons from a ROWE Workplace. In this video, we will review what a ROWE workplace is and how these lessons can be applied to the current work-from-home environment we are all experiencing. Our presenter today will be Jeff Engelstein. He's the president of Mars International and a longtime advocate of a results-oriented workplace. Thank you again for joining us. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel for future video releases and check out our website at marsint.com. Without further delay, I will pass it over to Jeff.
Thanks for that introduction, Jason. I'd like to start the presentation today by telling a story about one of our employees. This happened about 10 years ago. And this person was one of our top people, single mom, and came to me very upset one morning, very concerned. Her child had just moved into a new grade, and now the way their school district worked, the bus was not going to pick them up until 9:30. And so she was 9:15. She was going to get to the office around 9:45, 10 o'clock. And at that point, we had what we called flex time, where you could start. We had kind of fixed working hours, but you had a choice of an 8 o'clock start time, an 8:30 start time, or a 9 o'clock start time. And this was going to be outside those boundaries. She wanted to be home and make sure that her child got on the bus okay, and then was going to come in. But, you know, she felt because of this that she was potentially going to lose her job, that, you know, she wasn't, that we were going to sit with that and, force her to come in one of those times. And she was not willing to sacrifice, the time and the potential safety of her child, that she wanted to get them off in the morning. And this really kind of struck me. I mean, here was one of our top people. You know, she was emailing all day and all night. I could tell, I had no doubt that, whether she came into the office at 8 a.m. or whether she actually came into the office at 9:30 or 10 a.m., that it was, the performance was going to be the same. I was going to get the same quality of work. She was going to make sure that her customers were taken care of and everything was going to be good. But, here she was worried that she was going to get fired over this and she wasn't going to be able to stay with us. So I told her, I said, look, no problem. We'll adjust your time. You can come in at 9:30 or 10, but don't tell anybody else that I made these special arrangements. I want to keep everybody else staying on the same time. And so, we did that and, moved ahead with that. And she's still with us today. But, it kind of started me thinking, I'm like, why did I not want to tell the other people that I was doing this? Why did I not want to potentially offer this kind of flexibility across the board? Why would these working hours be such a huge issue, especially for our type of business, right? We're not a store that we have our doors have to open at a certain time, or a factory where everybody's on a production line and everyone have to do it. We have elements of that in our business, but, basically it's sort of a knowledge business. We have flexibility to work from different areas and at different times. And so that kind of started me on a quest to start looking at different options for the way to kind of structure our company and different types of work environments. And ultimately, I discovered something called ROWE, which stands for Result Only Work Environment. And if you go to gorowe.com, there's a lot of details there about what it is. But, basically, the basics of the system was that you are dealing with a few ideals. The first one is that you are focusing on results. You're not concerned about the time that people come in. The key performance attribute is, are they achieving the results? Are their customers happy? Are the sales what they're supposed to be? Are they processing administratively the things that they're supposed to be doing? That's what you should be focusing on. Whether somebody comes in at 9 o'clock or 9:15, whether somebody takes 30 minutes for lunch or 45 minutes for lunch or an hour and 10 minutes for lunch, it really shouldn't matter. We should be focused on the results. The other thing was that work is a thing you do, not a place you go. This is kind of dealing with the results. So if you can accomplish your results from a coffee shop, then maybe you do it from a coffee shop. If you can do it from home, then that's fine. If you have to be in the office to do it, then that's fine too. The ideal is that, kind of wherever you can get your work done, it's fine to do your work done from there. Next was that there's no individual working hours. So people can, kind of set up the hours that they want to do. And I underline individual here because I'm going to come back to that later. There can be organizational working hours or departmental working hours. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But, an individual person doesn't necessarily have to be nailed down to a very specific working hour schedule. And finally, just in general, treating people like adults. The basis of the system is that people know what they need to get done. They understand what their jobs are. They understand what the performance is, and it's up to them to figure out how to achieve that. And that you don't need to be super micromanaging people. As I looked into it, there were these are the ideals, and we'll talk a little bit later about, some compromises that we needed to make and some adjustments that we made in our implementation. But a lot of this really kind of made sense to me. It certainly would have fit this one person. She needed to come in at 9:30 instead of at 9. And, that's not going to lose her job. As long as, she can get her work done, then that's fine. We can work with that and we can work around that. So the goals that we were looking for, again, the kind of things that I was looking to implement in a new system, is I wanted to have clear and consistent rules that applied to all the employees. I didn't want flex time to be something secret, as I mentioned with this story. Originally I told this particular person, hey, don't tell anybody else that I'm letting you have this kind of special treatment. And we shouldn't have a situation where I've got certain rules for this person, rules for another person, or it's like a perk that you get if you're, achieving certain levels. I wanted something that was consistent across the board. We wanted employees to feel like they had flexibility and control over what they were doing. I had a lot of situations where people, again, would be freaking out if they had to take a kid to a doctor, or themselves they had to go for a doctor's appointment. Or they needed to go to the bank over lunch, and they'd have to, ask special permission or something like that to take an extra 15 minutes or 20 minutes or something for lunch. I didn't want to have to deal with that level of micromanaging. So that was another big thing that we're looking to have. And finally, we wanted to put in a system that would help us retain people and attract the best people. We're in New Jersey. We're pretty close to Manhattan and Philadelphia, and there's a lot of major companies there that have a lot of big benefits. Some of them we're able to offer, some of them we're not able to offer, but we felt that we could compete in terms of our work environment. We could offer people the flexibility to kind of be better able to balance their work life and their home life. And that was one of the goals. We felt that would act as a recruiting tool to kind of keep people working for us. So after a lot of discussion and internal reviews and seminars and all kinds of different things, we did finally implement the results-only work environment back in 2013. And so what I want to talk about today is get into what we learned from that experience and how we had to modify it for COVID, and hopefully some key takeaways for you to bring back to your organizations. Whether you implement ROWE, that's a pretty big deal. But I feel that the current situation with so many people working from home and, how that's going to play out down the road, I think really, a lot of the lessons that we learned are going to be applicable. And so this is long-term stuff, right? We'll talk about, with everyone, even though it's been going on for a while now, it's been about 6 months as of the time we're doing this, that a lot of places have been in lockdown and offices have been shut down. We've been doing this for 7 years, and we found the first 6 months was kind of easy, and then it got harder. It was hard at first, then easy, then hard. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So the three key factors that I want to kind of dive into here are the results, which obviously is right. The first letter of ROWE is the results and how you deal with that. The communication issues. And finally, a kind of an intangible one, which I'm sure that many of you have been feeling with so many people working from home, is trust and how you deal with that. So let's dive right into results. First is that, at least for us when we did this, back in 2013, is that you couldn't just look at people's job descriptions and say, this is our result. This is defining the results. Everyone kind of sort of knew what they were doing, and, we had basic, kind of annual performance reviews and things that people look at and departmental metrics and stuff like that. But we had to go well beyond people's job descriptions. It also forced us to rethink people's responsibilities. We had to look and say, what is, is this, and we kind of had results on different levels. There was individual level results, but then there was also departmental level results. And then we had to kind of figure out how everybody was in there. So that was also looking at, better defining for people, hey, this is what you're responsible for. These are the results you have to achieve. And some of this maybe you can do on your own. And some of it is depending on other people. But these are some of the things that you need to look at. So that was a lot of activity early on, was just for each department going through and defining that. Some of the results for the administrative people, for example, took the form of, process X numbers of items by Y or something like that. So for example, we have a standing thing that any orders that come in, any orders that come in by a certain time have to be processed the same day. And in general, orders that come in have to be processed within the latest 24 hours. So that's an example of a very specific and measurable administrative result. And maybe you've got that kind of thing in place. We didn't. We were just kind of, we still processed all the orders, and we processed the orders relatively quickly, but it wasn't something that we tracked. But when everybody was, out of the office or people were out and about, we were, how do we know that somebody's actually doing this? And so you set clear expectations like that. You have to do, or you have to do a certain number in a day. There needs to be a number of things, or, on a weekly basis, you have to do this status report or whatever. There was very specific, kind of processes that needed to be achieved. Others were project-based. And this was probably the smallest transition for us. Many of you listening to this webinar who are familiar with Mars and what we do know that we have a very strong engineering team, and that's a product development is a very big part of what we do. And for that, we had already defined, the development teams knew that their result was they needed to deliver a design by a certain date with a certain set of features. And so that was a little bit easier, but that's another form that your result can take, is that there's a milestone or a deadline or target that needs to be hit. And the other thing that we had, I touched on this a little bit, but going back, as you remember on back in the slide talking about the ideals of ROWE, is this idea of there is no individual working hours, and I underlined individual. And the reason is that while we don't mandate, a very strict individual schedule of when you come in and when you don't, we do have departmental availability schedules. So for example, the accounting department has very specific hours. They need to be available to answer questions for the other departments between certain hours. Similarly, like our shipping and receiving department, right? There's orders that need to go out. Trucks are coming in to deliver stuff. It's not just a free-for-all. It's there's specific times. Now, within those times, the team leaders, the departmental managers they have the flexibility of working with the people to set up the times when stuff, people respect people's individual schedules and what they want to do, while still ensuring that there is some coverage. So this forces redundancy, this forces cross-training, all of which are really good things in my book. These are things that you want to kind of do anyway, but because you can't always lean on that person necessarily being there, there needs to be some level of coverage. It also means that there's got to be a lot of communication. You can't just, it's not just a free-for-all, right? You can't just vanish. You can't just, disappear. There's got to be conversation. There's got to be discussion so that we know that the things that need to be covered are being covered. So that's the difference in a departmental goal and departmental hours versus individual hours, which I think is really important, particularly as people are working at home and stuff like that. There needs to be somebody on the team that's available, and the other people need to, in the company, need to know who to go to and how to get in touch with somebody to get specific questions answered if they need specific questions answered. Next is filler tasks. And filler may sound a little derogatory, and I didn't mean it to be, but that was just kind of the word that came to mind for this. Is look, there's some tasks that you do that aren't really part of your regular day-to-day, right? Maybe you go through and you reorganize some of your files, or you just go through and do some reading and do some training or studying about something like that. And sometimes if you've got fixed working hours, just for sake of argument, let's say you're working from 9 to 5, right? If you get all your work done by 4, something like that, and you say, well, I got to sit here at I'm going to be hanging out at my desk here at 5, I've got to do coverage or whatever. I'm just going to do this. You can go through your list and say, hey, I haven't done this in a while. I'm going to go through, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to catch up on this. I'm going to do this stuff. One of the fears that we had when we were defining results is that people were only going to do the stuff that they had specific results for. That some of these filler tasks, would just not happen anymore, because somebody would say, oh, it's 4 o'clock and I'm done and I don't need to be here for coverage, so I'm out of here. I'm just going to head out, which is fine, and it's within the spirit of ROWE. But we want people to. We didn't want to break it down so people just did the bare minimum. That's one of the concerns that we have, and I'm sure you kind of get that feeling when you're at home, have people working from home. One of the key tenets of ROWE is not equating face time with working time or office time or desk time or whatever. It's very easy as a manager to point to it and say, hey, you're supposed to be here at 9 and you got here at 9:03, and you're supposed to stay here until 5, and I saw you slip away from your desk at 4:55 or whatever. And it's an easy way to manage, because it's a lot easier to point to that than to really look at the results that somebody's achieving and what they're accomplishing. But there is some benefit to people just kind of, having a little bit of extra time to fill, because there are tasks that tend not to be on the, the straight line job description that sometimes can get done if you just have a little bit of extra time. So you may actually need to go back and define those. And we've done that to a certain extent. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the last thing, which is kind of related to this, is long-term goals. And I think this is kind of an issue across the board, whether you're running a ROWE environment or a work from home environment, or whether you're just running a, normal where everybody comes to the office every day environment. The day-to-day, these very, very specific short-term results will get in the way of the longer-term stuff that you want to do with people. Do mentoring, managerial training, other types of training. All that stuff you want to happen. And if you want to have it happen, it needs to be defined as some of the results that people are doing. Okay, the next broad category is communication. And, communication is always important, and I think is always a challenge in organizations, particularly as they grow. But as you get into a distributed environment, whether it's ROWE or just, COVID-related people working from home, it becomes even more important. And that also is going to tie into the trust, which we'll talk about in a little bit of a second. One of the big things that we've found in terms of communications that we really have been working with and continue to work with is inter-team versus intra-team. I did that backwards in what's on the slide, but intra-team is internal communications within a team or a department, and intra-team is communication between different teams. When we started ROWE, after a year or so, 6 months, we would do temperature checks, we would talk to the different teams, and it was funny after a while, because I would sit down with each department. I'd sit down with supply chain, or I'd sit down with engineering or whatever, and I would say, how is everything going with ROWE? How is it working? And they would say, like accounting would say, we're great. Works great for us. We know what we're doing. Everybody, inside our team, everyone has their jobs. Everybody knows what's happening. It's working fantastically. The big problem we have is that those guys in supply chain, they don't know what they're doing. They're never around. They don't respond. They don't do this. And every single department thought that their department was handling it great, and the other departments were not handling it well. And maybe some of that is just, you like the team that you're on, you're rooting for the home team. But I think part of it was just, it just came down to the communications. The team members are all talking to each other. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but, we would have, We instituted, kind of regular meetings, daily meetings, weekly meetings. They're talking to each other all the time. But, if you're not in the office, it's the inter-team communications that you really need to focus on. Well, again, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later with some more ideas. You've got to make sure that we have understanding of responsibilities and expectations. The results that people are supposed to be achieving, those availability times. I talked about coverage of who's covering for who. You need to know where to go, who to talk to, and the expectations of who's going to be available. As part of that, we spend a lot of time talking about communication response times. The idea is the expectation, when you're all in an office, there's what we call drive-bys. That's where you just walk over to somebody's desk. You need an answer now, and you just walk over to somebody's desk and lean over their cubicle and say, hey, hey, Bob, I need an answer on this. Do you know what's going on? And that's not great for a couple of reasons. Well, first off, if you're in a distributed environment working from home, you just can't do that because people aren't necessarily going to be there. And then you get frustrated because they're not there. And that's when you start getting those complaints. Hey, I'm not getting any response. But it interrupts the other person's work. So you don't know what's going on with them. In general, it's just not a great way to operate. There's a lot of studies, maybe I'll do another webinar on that, but there's a lot of psychology studies that talk about, when your work gets interrupted, if you're working on a task and you leave the task and go to do something else, even if it's only for like 60 seconds, it can take several minutes to get back onto catching up where you were on your other task, particularly really, thought-intensive tasks, analyzing spreadsheets or doing engineering work or coding or something like that. So we wanted to really eliminate that to get people focused on their work and also because, somebody may not be in your office to do a drive-by. So what we defined is a communication response window, which is if I send you an email or if I send you a text or if I leave you a phone mail message, when can I expect to hear back from you? We have defined that very explicitly in our organization that, if you send somebody an email, you need to respond to it, within 2 hours. And part of that is going to have to do with, part of dealing with that is that sometimes you can't respond in 2 hours. If you happen to be going away, if you have a doctor's appointment and you're out of the office or whatever, or if you've got a meeting, if I'm in a long meeting or something like that, I may not be able to do it. Or if I happen to be working on a really complicated task. And response, though, doesn't necessarily mean a full answer. Okay, response means at least somebody's getting back to you to let you know what's going on, that they don't know the answer or they're busy working on something else and when they'll get back to you, or it's just some form of thing. But also the other key part is people need to keep their calendars up to date, right? If I want to get an answer from Alice, I can just, send Alice an email and just assume I'll get an answer in a reasonable time. But if it's something that's really going to be critical for me, it's kind of behooves me to go look at Alice's calendar and say, oh, I see that Alice has got wall-to-wall meetings, for the next 3 hours. So I'm not going to be expecting a response. So again, that goes back to communication and what we talk about, like behaving like adults, right? If somebody sends you an email and says, hey, I need this information, even if you can't do it, don't just ignore it. Right? Just respond and say, hey, got your request. When do you really need this by? I'm super busy right now. Can I get it to you by Friday? Is that okay? And that goes back to behaving like adults. So, we treat people like adults, but we expect them to behave like adults. And behaving like adult is not vanishing for 6 hours and nobody knows how to get a hold of you and you're not responding to anything and you're not getting any answers. And that kind of begs a question about vacation time. Now, if you read the books on ROWE and stuff like that, I mean, their big position is there should be no vacation time. And you do hear about companies that are doing this more and more. There's just people can take off when they want to take off. And ultimately, I'd like to get to that. We're not at that point right now. We still have formal vacation time. But if people are just working from home and people can kind of do the hours that they want or whatever, how do you define vacation time? And the way we define it is around these response times. So if you're generally not going to be able to respond within the response time, that's a vacation day. And it's a vacation half a day. We have people do that and things like that. So it's basically if you're getting your results done and your response time is going to be what it needs to be according to our system, then you're working. You're not on vacation. If it's not going to be that, if you're not getting your results done, and if you are not being responsive within a certain window, then that's a vacation day. Because sometimes surprisingly it can get a little bit fuzzy. I mean, that's I guess one of the benefits, I suppose, that we kind of saw from when we switched to ROWE is that people took a lot less vacation time. We found that people would take vacation days. People would take vacation days if they just needed to go to a doctor or needed to help their child out or something like that. But now, by giving the flexibility, people actually took fewer vacation days, which was pros and cons. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into COVID and the issue that we dealt with there. And finally is trust. Trust is an intangible, but it's an important thing. And it goes back to, it's, again, if I'm walking by, if I need an answer from Alice and I walk over to her desk and she's there, I can just stand there until she's off the phone and I can just ask her right then and there, right? And if I don't see her, then is she there? Am I going to get an answer? Is it going to come in time? And stuff like that. So you've got to trust that people are going to do their work, trust that people are going to be responsive, and so on. One of the things that ROWE, a term used in ROWE in their materials, is called sludge. And sludge is just a lot of kind of mainly time-based stuff. When you're sitting by the window and you see somebody coming back from their lunch is supposed to be from 12 to 1, and you see them coming into the office at 1:15, or you see somebody slipping out at 11:30 one day, and you're like, oh, they're not really working, or you see some, or coming in late, leaving early, whatever. Just the negativity that's strictly based on what you see, people doing on a surface level, but not from their results. If somebody's not giving you the results and somebody's not meeting the communication windows, then yeah, that's a problem. But if somebody's doing all their stuff, but they decide one day they need to take an extended lunch or something, that shouldn't be a big deal. And that's called sludge. And you want to try to get rid of that in your organization, get rid of that kind of, petty stuff. But it constantly does need to be reinforced. Trust is, it's very easy to break trust and people to lose trust. But it is, it's hard to build that back up. So the communication is important for that. There's a lot of elements that are important with that. And then the last element on trust here that I want to touch base with is fire drills, which has to do with drive-bys also, which is that because of people are working in a distributed fashion, because you can't just walk over to somebody's desk and badger them until they give you an answer, right? You need to plan your work better. Your emergency is not my emergency. It's something I like to tell people when they come to me and they're like, hey, I've been in situations where somebody needed to do a proposal and they've had a week to prepare the proposal. And then 20 minutes before it's supposed to go out, they come to me and, Jeff, I need you to sign off on this. Can you review this? Can you answer this question? Well, look, you had a week to do this. Maybe I'm doing something else. I'm not going to drop everything to do it. So you need to plan your work better. Everyone needs to plan their work better, and they need to understand that, it's not going to be instant responsiveness. And honestly, this is the kind of thing I think should be, whether in any type of an office environment, I think this is important, but it's a lot easier to violate this. It's a lot easier to, to kind of sidestep this issue if, everyone's in the same office together and everybody's physically there and that everyone's locked in there between the hours of X and X. It's easy to just assume you're going to be able to grab the people that you need and get the last minute advice that you need. We push into people's head that A, don't do it, and B, if somebody does it to you, you have the right to push back. And if they're giving you a problem, then you can go to the manager, or if your manager is doing it, you can come to me. But you have to have a reasonable time frame to get stuff done in. Now, I put necessarily in there because sometimes there are true emergencies. And in our example, they are almost always customer driven. Sometimes the customers come in and the customers are having a problem, or there's, they have a big spike or they need to get an answer really quickly. And customers are allowed to drive that. Customers can drive emergencies and you can come to me. But if you come to me and it's something that you've had on your desk for a week and now you've decided to get to it, I'm not going to do it. But if a customer comes to you and says, hey, I need to get an answer on this, within an hour or two, we're having a problem in the field or something, I need technical support help or whatever it is, then yes, that is an emergency and you're entitled to come to me and tell me I've got an emergency and I need your help on this and I need to get it done. So again, this goes back to, communication and trust and just that true emergencies are dealt with in an effective way. So what are some of the pros that we've learned over the years of having this type of distributed workforce? So first, it removes a lot of irritation. There's just a lot of little stuff that you don't realize. And I think that a lot of you have probably experienced this working from home over the last 6 months, although I'm sure that it's created its own sources of irritation for those of you that have kids at home and stuff like that. But, in general, there's just a lot of little stuff that you sometimes worried about or things like that this just kind of takes away. It forces you also to focus on what's important. Again, going through and specifying the results. There's a lot of extraneous stuff that people are doing and things like that tends to fall by the wayside. And it's important just in general, ask why. Why are we doing this? Why am I collecting this data? Why do I need somebody to fill out this form? Why do I need somebody to approve this? Look at all your processes and see what it is. And this is going to force you to do that. If you've got people working all over the place, you have to, you can't fall back into the old habits, the old bad habits that you had. And it has been really effective for us as a recruitment and retention tool. Employees have specifically told me that, hey, they've been recruited, they've gotten other jobs offers, but they just don't have that opportunity to, to be as flexible as we allow people to be. So it's, it absolutely has enabled us to compete with, the big guys, compete with the Googles and the other larger companies that, that we do. But as with all things, there are negatives, and we have found a bunch of them. One is that it puts a lot more pressure on managers. It is really easy to manage when, well, I can say it's easy, but it's an easy way to manage is just to make sure people are at their desks at 9 and they don't leave their desks until 5, right? That's an easy way to manage. FaceTime managing. But it's not effective. But, the results-oriented way of managing is a harder thing to do. You've got to really tell people what your expectations are of them. You've got to have a way to check to make sure that that's really happening. You've got to improve the communications and make sure your team is talking to each other. And sometimes you got to do difficult things and tell people, hey, I need you to be here at a certain time. I know that for whatever reason, maybe you can't one day, but, like I said, sometimes a department needs people at certain places. So it's harder on the managers to do properly. It puts a lot of stress on team building and, ultimately loss of cohesion. Having been around, having to be able to go out for lunch or whatever, it's great to do. And if you can't do that on a regular basis, which certainly we've seen with COVID, it's going to lead to a deterioration of the bonds that can bind the company together. Interdepartmental communication is a big one they talked about. As I said, in general, our individual teams have been working well together. They meet frequently. They talk to each other. They know what's going on. But it's that interdepartmental stuff that can be a challenge. Who's your contact person? Who's going to be doing stuff? Where's things happening? Who's doing what on the team? So all that kind of stuff needs to be talked about, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of those strategies. And some people are not going to be able to adjust. You are going to lose some people along the way. Perhaps you already have when switching to, strictly a work from home environment, that some people just couldn't deal with it. And we found that when we switched to ROWE back in 2013, there were some people, they just took it as license to be completely AWOL, and that's not what it's about. You still have to get your work done. You still have to communicate with people. You still have to maintain everybody's trust. So some of the adaptations, and we talked about some of these already, but just to kind of pull these together, is, first training. And and I say for training for ROWE, it tends to be more discussions and training. It wasn't like we went in and we're like, here's the way we're going to be doing it. What we did, particularly during the first couple of years, is we would get everyone together on like a quarterly basis and have like a ROWE summits, and we would just have an open forum. Our company's like 50 people, so we can afford to do that and have everybody in a room. We just have these open summits and discussions about what's working, what's not. How do we set these communication deadlines, for example? What's reasonable? Is this working? Is it not working? So training is important more as a communication tool to make sure that everybody understands the expectations. We did find, until COVID at least, and when we had to close the office, except for our vital functions, is that most people actually used it just as an escape hatch. There was, very few people that like just totally decided they were going to work from home. Ultimately we allowed that as an option if somebody wanted to do it, but really nobody did. Just about everybody came in. And people used it a little bit to kind of flex their hours around, but mostly people used it, like I said, for doctor's appointments, or if they wanted to go to school to see us, if it was a career day at school or something and they wanted to go, just stuff like that, that people used it for. And so that was part of the effectiveness of it. One of the things, if you go read the ROWE materials, one of the things that they put in there is all meetings are optional. And it's interesting because over the years they've kind of backpedaled from that a little bit, but we do not have all meetings are optional. There are some meetings that you need to be at, and that goes back to that communication platforms. Like we have daily and weekly meetings, a rhythm. So we have like most departments will have a daily huddle for like 15 minutes where they'll get together and talk about it. And you need people you have to pick a time when everybody's basically going to be there. If you need to miss it once or twice, obviously that's going to happen, but there needs to be some kind of signpost in the day when the team kind of all comes together. Our company-wide events became even more important. Again, with 50 people, and this goes back to that interdepartmental, is you got to come up with ways for everybody to kind of talk to each other and be in the same place at the same time and keep those kind of social bonds going, which are just as important as professional bonds sometimes. And we also did some very specific interdepartmental mixers. As I said, there was, because of this interdepartmental issues, sometimes we would get like supply chain and engineering, and let's just have a meeting. And I guess mixers, it wasn't purely social. I was basically get the departments together and say, hey, how do we work together? How do we not work together? What can we do to improve it? But just set a time for different departments and teams to come together. And we found that some functions improved and others degraded. And that was, then we had to tackle those and figure out what we needed to do. So, monitoring your business, focusing on what's going on, not just assuming everything's working. It's a transition and it's a change. And I'm sure you've all been experiencing that over the last 6 months. But it's one that really kind of continues. And we also learned, as we all know from our relationships with friends and family, that trust is hard. And once it's broken, it's really hard to rebuild that. And it's a constant process. It's a lot of small successes that, if I go to Alice, I know I'm going to hear back from her within an hour. And I know if I don't hear back from her, there's a reason. And from my part, if you send me an email, even if I can't do it right away, I'm going to send you an email back that says, hey, I can't do it, but I can do it, sometime tomorrow. Is that good enough? Just something that's that simple. So how did these things change for us with COVID? First of all, for us, going to, when we had to close our office, and again, for us, our assembly area was always open, and, manufacturing was allowed to continue in New Jersey, so that part happened, and our shipping and receiving always stayed open. But it was much easier transition for us than it was for other companies that I talked to. We were already set up where people knew how to operate from home. People, we had these communication tools set up. We had these kind of remote meetings set up. So for us, it was a pretty, I won't say simple, but it was, I think, easier than for a lot of other people. But one of the things I saw, which I thought was interesting, and perhaps you're experiencing this as well, is that we had like what I call an adrenaline rush and then a hangover. So when it first happened, back in March, into into April, everybody was on point. Everybody was really focused. We're transitioning, we're doing this, let's talk, let's keep going, let's get things moving. And that carried us. And starting in maybe July or August, I started to notice, what I'm calling the hangover, which is, when your adrenaline kind of wears off, and you're getting a little tired and a little jittery or whatever. And it's just, we started to see a degradation in performance, and we've had to kind of redouble our efforts and mix things up a little bit to try to get everybody refocused and say, hey, I know we were kind of running on that adrenaline for a couple of months, but we've got to switch into a mode that's sustainable. And that's, going to be in there for the long haul. And just as before, part of the businesses actually went smoother. One of the things we found is like a lot of our more serious concentration-based work, which I guess isn't surprising, like engineering. So we've actually been better at like hitting engineering targets and development targets and coding and stuff like that. I think we just had a lot of draws, even though we kind of railed against them and tried to have a corporate culture against them. There was still a lot of little things that kind of popped in to interrupt the concentration of people doing the designing who need like 2, 3, 4, 8 focused hours sometimes to get this stuff done. So there weren't as many of those little interruptions. And I think that just emphasized to me our intuition on that is that those interruptions are really causing a lot of degradation. But there were other parts of it that did go worse. As I said, the interdepartmental stuff was a problem. Just in general, the kind of informal communications, people can just lean over a desk and, if there are people working in close proximity to each other and get a quick answer or something like that, that all became a problem. And we were able to get past it, as I'm sure most of you were, but it's still, I think, is operating slower on some areas. Not to harp on this, but again, our interdepartmental communication was even tougher, and I talked about some of the strategies that we used to deal with that. But we are expecting that we will, going to continue. We're going to keep ROWE. I am anticipating that although some people are coming back to the office, we're not planning on putting in our office has always been open and people can come if they want, and we've got safety measures in place there. But our attitude has been, look, if you want to work from home, work from home. If you want to come in, come in. It's up to you. So it's basically the same ROWE platform for us. And whereas before, as I mentioned, over the first 7 years that we've been doing this, it was mainly used as an escape hatch. I am confident that more people are going to be working from home, whether it's 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever. I see that already. So I think people are going to start filtering in, but I do believe that this COVID experience has fundamentally changed the way that that we are going to operate, and I'm sure that a lot of companies are going to operate. We do not plan on going back and saying, you have to come into the office. We weren't saying that before, so for us it would be kind of a step backwards to tell our employees, you have to start coming in. We're just, same thing as we were. We're generally open. You can come in to use the facilities. It's still useful sometimes to come in for meetings and reviews and stuff like that. And if you're needed, you're needed. But in general, you're on your own recognizance. So the key takeaways that I would kind of like to highlight here, just quickly, are to have a clear definition of expectations and results. That's part of your initial definition process, and perhaps you've gone through some of that, but I would emphasize to focus on the expectations, particularly the longer term tasks and the filler tasks that you don't really think about sometimes that may not be getting done. Managing will be more challenging, so you're going to need to support your managers, and they may not even be able to cut it. I mean, ultimately, you may need to make replacements in your management structure. Set up response time windows and ways that people can contact other people. We have had now for, since very shortly after we started ROWE, we set up a company cell number directory. So everybody has access to everybody's cell number. And I actually had some resistance to that. We had a couple of employees that did not want to give out their cell number. And, we just kind of forced the issue on that. I mean, that's part of working for us is your cell number has to be there. And, you don't have to pick up the phone every time somebody calls or respond to a text immediately, but you have to respect those response time windows. People have to have different ways to be able to get in touch with you. Focus on the interdepartmental communication. We've talked about that a lot. But I will say that, we've seen that people will be happier in the long run. We've seen our employee retention has been good. We've 100% of people say to us that that was one of the reasons that they wanted to stay or wanted to come to work for us. So, competing for talent, it's a cliche to say, but, the organizations are their people. And if you get the best people and keep the best people, then you're going to have a much better organization for it. So this can be a positive thing. It can certainly have its negatives, but in the long run, we've seen it as a positive thing, and we've seen it as an important element of our corporate culture. So that's the event. I hope that that gave you some food for thought. I appreciate your attention. I guess I ran a little bit longer than I was anticipating here, so I apologize for that. But it's a topic that I'm passionate about and that we've had a lot of experience, so I hope that you've learned from some of that. We've been responding to questions in the chat. If you want to stick around a little bit for that in the chat, I will be jumping in there and responding to questions there. So thanks again. And, if you have any questions, you can email me directly. My email is up here on the last slide as well. So if you'd prefer to just do it one-on-one and get my feedback, I'd be happy to do that as well. So thanks again for your time and attention. And we hope to see you at our next webinar in October.